So, Ronan Taylor, thanks for joining me. Good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, no, it's great being here. Very excited about this.
So, let's start with you a little bit. So what is your educational background? What is your title now? Like what exactly what are you doing?
Well, I guess they'd call myself a naturalist. My background is very eclectic. It's been everything from studying spiders at the Smithsonian to working with large reptiles to, studying human ecosystem impacts throughout history. And now I'm growing trees. So, my background is quite diverse. And as a result, I just kind of like this umbrella title of naturalist.
So where did you go to school at? Like what is your degree in?
My degree is in biology, just kind of general. I'm really only working with the bachelor's right now.
Oh, okay. All right. So you're more like an in the field guy.
I am only in the field. If there's one thing I do not enjoy, it is academia. I think people in
Sure.
academia get far too comfortable, they get far too specialized. And when you're in academia, not only do you kind of like, I think, lose connection with a lot of the world, kind of in an ivory tower sense, but I also think that you lose a sense of the bigger picture. A lot of academia really encourages you to get as specialized as possible and become an expert in kind of like that one specific thing. And I think, as I mentioned before, you lose sight of the big picture, which when you're studying the natural world is not a good thing because in nature, everything is so intimately connected and there's just so much of it that losing sight of that bigger picture is ultimately going to be detrimental to whatever research you're doing.
Sure. Well, let's get into the organization then. What is Biospheric Restoration Systems? Tell me about the organization, the history of it, and what exactly it does. And I know you don't have a problem doing this, but just a small disclaimer: explain it in layman's terms.
Okay, can do. So, Biospheric Restoration Systems, we're a very new organization, and we are attempting to develop new technologically driven methods of environmental restoration. A lot of people in environmental restoration tend to be somewhat Luddite-ish. They tend to kind of be technophobic almost. And I think, once again, at the detriment of the work itself. Right now, our flagship project is what's called the Green Phoenix Project, where we're attempting to use hydroponics technology to scale up the Miyawaki method of reforestation. And the reason
So,
we're doing
so
this is essentially,
well,
oh,
hold
go,
on. Let me
yeah.
let me jump in. Like, what is that? I mean, what is the Mio? Sorry, yeah. Say it again.
Miyo,
The Miyawaki
so
reforestation. I've read this on your website, but it's like, what is this? And also I wasn't sure how to pronounce it, and I probably just butchered it. But yeah, like, so what is that exactly?
So the Miyawaki method is, in some respects, the most powerful in reforestation method ever developed. It is capable of growing forests that are indistinguishable from ones untouched by human activity in as little as a decade. Normally, that process would take centuries. And it works through kind of a few different factors. The first is you have to look at what's called potential natural vegetation. And that whole concept is basically, what does a community of plants look like in a certain area without human interference? And determining that can be quite challenging. We're doing our test right now in Scotland, so we've been having to study kind of human impacts throughout Scottish history and the different ways humans can alter kind of a plant community's composition is really amazing. Like, for example, hazel appeared to be like very common throughout Scotland. But what we found is the reason hazel was so common is because people here 8,000 years ago loved the seeds so much that they were deliberately planting them everywhere. And that species became way more common directly as a result of human activity. I mean, that's the thing. You walk through a forest, odds are it's been heavily modified by human activity. It doesn't even matter like how remote or wild it seems. I've even been to like parts of the Amazon rainforest where it's like, looks completely wild, looks like no one's been there for thousands of years. But when you actually get down to the different plants that are there, like Brazil nut, you have a similar thing with hazelnuts. People throughout the Amazon deliberately planted Brazil nuts everywhere. And as a result, Brazil nuts are like now the most common species in that entire rainforest. So pretty much everywhere you go, you are looking at a heavily modified ecosystem. So what the first step with the Miyawaki method is kind of just taking a look back and seeing, okay, what changes have we made to this environment, taking that into account, and then basically you're designing the entire forest on a spreadsheet where the amount of like a certain species you're planting is going to be, kind of reflected on a percentage of what you're planting in that area.
So basically, you do an analysis of the area and you kind of assess, okay, these are the types of things that will make growth flourish in the best way possible. And then you make it happen, and that will allow it to happen a lot quicker than it would be if you just kind of let it do whatever it's going to do on its own.
Basically, yeah, we're just looking at like what species existed and what numbers prior to human intervention in that environment. So, we're looking at like what this forest essentially would have looked like 10,000 years ago. In the case of Scotland, that means we're basically like dredging up old bits of bog and looking at microscopic pollen samples that have been preserved in that bog for thousands of years and looking at what trees were there and in what numbers. So that's really the first
So
step is
you
okay,
can
you're
do that. You can do that with like a deep enough soil sample.
oh yeah, it's
That's
crazy some of the things you can
crazy.
do. Oh, that's not even like the craziest thing you can do. Did you hear about like what happened in
Like
Greenland
cool
recently with the
crazy.
oh yeah, yeah. It's amazing. And that's the thing. And this is actually there's even newer technologies that we're going to try to incorporate in kind of future plantings to get a better idea of what these kinds of areas looked like before humans showed up. There's a new tool called sedimentary DNA surveys. Any living thing in an environment, what can happen is, whether you're shedding your skin, leaves, really, you're leaving traces of your DNA everywhere you go. And pretty much every organism does this. So what happens is you can take soil samples that are thousands and thousands of years old, where the DNA is still preserved, and you can see what was living in that environment at the time just by looking at these ancient DNA samples contained within the soil.
That's incredible. I mean, that's just wow. Okay. So that's basically what biospheric restoration is shooting to do. Like let's find out the natural ecosystem and let's, make it happen again before humans were messing around here. So then we're basically going to get the forest back more or less. And we all know
Yeah,
how
the whole
helpful trees
flaw.
are.
Yeah, well, that's our whole philosophy is basically how do we need to identify what damage we've done to the planet because the damage we've been doing to the planet did not begin with the industrial revolution. We've been leaving an impact on the planet for millennia. I mean, basically since we've left Africa, we've completely transformed any environment we've gone into. So really what we're attempting to do is identify the various consequences of our actions throughout the millennia and undo them. Because at the end of the day, a natural environment is far better at sequestering carbon than anything else. Like identifying what this ecosystem looked like before human interference and replicating that is going to suck out more carbon than anything else we have right now.
So it's interesting, you mentioned some people in this space are a bit technophobic. When I just sort of look at the issue of climate change and talk to different perspectives in that space, I feel like there's always kind of two, I don't want to say extremes, but kind of like two camps where I feel like there should be more of an intersection. And it's like on one end, you have people who are really addressing the need for us to change our lives. And I think they're 100% right. We need to get off of fossil fuels completely. We need to really revisit our supply chain, our food chain, and it's capitalism that's causing all the problems with this. I'm all for those things, but then they take it to a place where they basically make it sound like we're just going to live like Amish people. And I think that's not only unrealistic, but there's also there's no reason why that has to be the case, I think. And then you have the other end of that, which is the complete other end where they're just like, oh, screw it. Let's just like not even worry about it because eventually technology is going to bail us out. And I think both of those, and I know like I'm kind of painting a caricature here, but I think both of those are incorrect when taken to the extreme. And the reality is, everything has a seat at the table. Technology is going to play a role, but it can't just be technology. We're going to have to change our lifestyles, but it's not going to just be that, and it's not like we're going to live by candlelight. And we also like there's just all of these factors kind of have a point. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, that's when I say people become too specialized. That's exactly what you're describing right there.
Hmm.
I think there is this complete lack of an interdisciplinary approach to the climate crisis, which is incredibly frustrating because this is an issue that ties into like everything. Pretty much if you name an issue, climate change ties into it somehow. Um, and what's very frustrating about that is, especially the viewpoint I find most frustrating is technology is just going to bail us out. Like,
Right.
that's not reality. Like I said, my background is, studying ecosystems and the climates of the past. And this is actually not the first time fossil fuels actually were combusted and led to climate change. If you look back about 250 million years ago, when Pangea first came together, it caused, a lot of new volcanoes formed as a result of the continental drift. Every single one of these continents colliding together created a ton of volcanoes. And this led to big magma fields, and that magma seeped into the crust and ignited coal deposits. And it's absolutely terrifying to think about because the resulting climate change um, that happened as a result of this combustion killed about 90% of life on Earth. It nearly was the end of multicellular life on Earth. And right now, we are replicating those conditions, but about 200 times faster. The reality is, it's like going carbon neutral by 2050. That's not going to be sufficient. We are living on borrowed time right now. I mean, we've already released enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to pretty much guarantee the apocalypse. If you look at what's happening recently in the North Atlantic, I don't know if you've been seeing, but we're having just these record temperatures just coming out of nowhere. And the reason for that is because there's this thing called the aerosol masking effect, where, aerosols are sort of the opposite of greenhouse gases, where what they do is they reflect sunlight into the back into space as opposed to kind of absorbing the thermal radiation from them. And what happens is even though these molecules and everything can reflect sunlight and everything, they really only last for about a week or so. And there's a certain irony to this because all of our industrial activity is releasing these molecules in conjunction with carbon. Now, keep in mind that carbon also lasts millennia in the atmosphere, not just a few weeks. So what happens is when these aerosols dissipate, they just get replaced by further industrial activity. And what's happened recently is there were new regulations for a lot of like shipping lanes and everything to switch to a certain new fuel. And this new fuel did not produce aerosols. So just out of nowhere, the Northern Atlantic has just shot up. And the temperature change this year has been so extreme, they've literally had to increase the height of the graph like by a pretty big margin. So right now, like I said, there's a certain dark irony to this where it's like pretty much all these different molecules we're releasing in the atmosphere along as a result of like fossil fuels combusting or as a result of like various industrial activities. Not only they're releasing greenhouse gases, but they're slowly kind of producing a certain inertia that's slowing this process down ever so slightly, but they can't last forever. That's the thing. Like I said, we're on borrowed time because just that slight reduction in aerosols led to a massive spike in temperatures in the Northern Atlantic.
So what would your and I know some of this is you're trying to anticipate just like everybody is to an extent, but what would your ideal solution look like to prevent complete climate catastrophe?
Well, so this is why I'm a huge advocate of what's called carbon negativity. Right now, governments are following a policy of carbon neutrality, where it's like they're trying to take out as much carbon as they're releasing by a certain year. And like I said, we've already put enough carbon in the atmosphere to basically guarantee the end of civilization as we know it. So really what we need to be doing is not just stop emitting in a relatively short time frame, like really 2050, forget it. We need to be talking like 2035 by the time we're like not emitting. Um, but also we need to be taking the carbon out of the atmosphere as much as possible in conjunction with this reduction. This is why I actually started this organization because, if we, that's what I'm doing with the Green Phoenix Project. If we can grow old growth forest on a large scale really fast, we can take out insane amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and cool the planet. there's actually a historical basis for this. If you look at what happened when the Europeans first introduced diseases into North America during the 1400s, urban centers and farmland and everything became abandoned en masse, and an area roughly the size of France was kind of reforested just over the course of 80 years, and this actually had a cooling effect on the entire planet. Just that area the size of France getting reforested. So if we can do large scale environmental restoration, I absolutely am confident that we can take enough carbon out of the atmosphere to avert this.
That's yeah, I mean, that's incredible. So what would it take for that to happen? I mean, what would it take as far as your organization is concerned? What kind of cooperation from governments would need to happen? I mean, this would be, and this is, I think, and I'm probably really preaching to the choir here, but this is one of the things that does frustrate me about the climate catastrophe is that there's a certain amount of top bottom solution that you kind of need here. You kind of need the people with all the money and the power to have the political will to end the fossil fuel industry and to start doing reforestation. And so what would it take?
I think it's going to take a number of things. Like you said, it is going to have to be top down. I mean, the reality is, look, yeah, communities around the world can, engage in their own restoration projects and everything, but the reality is that's not going to be enough. Another thing I think it's going to take is a massive shift in the food system. I mean, right now we're using about like 70% of all the habitable land on Earth for some form of farming. We could seriously reduce that number if people went vegan. For example, like, most of the crops we're growing right now go to the cattle, they go to our livestock. We're growing food for our food. It's incredibly inefficient. So the first step is really just, if you can get animal products out of your diet, do that. The other thing is, we also have technologies now like vertical farming, which are incredibly space efficient methods of growing food. I have been inside a shipping container that was repurposed into a vertical farm, and it was growing produce. And that shipping container was growing about 3 acres worth of produce every year. So there's some absolutely amazing ways that we could free up land for environmental restoration. And I absolutely think a shift in the food system is really going to be the big first step. The other thing I think is, when we talk about a Green New Deal, one thing I find very kind of frustrating about that whole discourse is, really seems to be entirely focused on, the United States, when really that should be a global initiative. I mean, the thing is, like, nature is so interdependent. It doesn't know our borders. Deforestation in the Amazon is actually one of the main causes of the drought we're seeing in California.
So speaking of that, you are American, but your
Sort of.
organization. Okay, well, I
I
mean,
was
we
born in
can get it.
London.
Oh, you were okay. Well, so I was gonna ask, would you spend time in the States, right?
Yeah, well, most of my life. The accent didn't give it away.
Okay, yeah, no, no. Well, I was just curious, how did you wind up doing this initiative in Scotland?
Well, Scotland is taking environmental restoration a lot more seriously than other countries.
Why do you think that is?
Relatively, it's just a more progressive country as a whole. I mean, that's the thing. People there are, far more enlightened on a whole variety of subjects than I'd say most countries I've been to. And there's a very proud tradition of kind of things like workers' rights and that kind of thing. In fact, the term heckling comes from Dundee, where I am right now.
Heckling?
Heckling, yeah.
Well, well, explain that. What do you mean? What's the history?
Well, there were a lot of I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that, generally whenever people were like shouting down the foreman at the jute mills here and everything, and whenever there was some kind of like strike that involved that, that's what they would call it, heckling, and that's where the term originates from.
Interesting. Well, I mean, as a comedian, when I hear the word heckling, I think of something
Oh,
much
right.
different.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
uh,
yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
but that's the thing. In Scotland, yeah, I just think as a whole is a much more progressive country, and I think that's actually kind of a lot of the fuel behind a lot of the independence movement here is that really, like, England and Scotland are really not aligned in this kind of more demand for progressive policy. Now, when I say Scotland's good with environmental restoration, I do say that relatively. Like, it's not great. I mean, in terms of like the standards of what we actually need to be doing, it's not great. But in terms of in terms of just comparing it to other countries, it's really quite something. World leader. Costa Rica, I'd say, is another one. Bhutan. Bhutan is actually the only country that has officially adopted carbon negativity as a national policy. So, I mean, shout out to them.
What about some of the Nordic countries? I mean, when you see some of like the energy efficient things that are going on in Denmark, are those some other good examples? Would you say?
Um, in some respects, yes, and in some respects, no. Some of the projects, especially with a lot of the dams, are having incredibly detrimental effects to a lot of the rivers and various other environmental factors, which is not ideal. The reality is also, if we're going to combat climate change, like I said, we need to enable natural systems to flourish. And when you put a dam in a river, you're basically just cutting that river in half and you're blocking the flow of organisms between it. And those organisms redistribute nutrients across the entire landscape. And you kind of reduce the whole functionality of the ecosystem when you do that, because those nutrients eventually just become other things. And when you block that, you basically, like I said, you reduce the whole functionality of that entire ecosystem.
So, what about? I mean, you brought up the food chain, which is something I spend a lot of time pondering as well. What about things like and I don't know a ton about this, but the like the slow food movement and stuff like that. We're basically speaking more general ways to really localize our food supplies to the best of our ability.
I I'm somewhat skeptical of a lot of it. The first one is kind of regenerative grazing, which is kind of the ideal that we can bring in cattle to replace the roles of large animals in an ecosystem, and in turn use that to suck out carbon. There is a large institute called the Savory Institute that's really kind of spearheading this movement. And the Savory Institute has published loads and loads of papers showing here's how we raise the cattle in a specific way to suck a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere. But no one outside the Savory Institute has been able to replicate the results. In fact, they have been implicated in a lot of frauds when it comes to removing carbon. And on top of that, the Savory Institute has backing from various ranching associations, McDonald's, not exactly the most trustworthy
Oh,
people.
yeah, I don't
Um,
I don't think that's what I yeah, that's interesting. I don't think that's not what I was I meant more
oh, I
like
see.
just yeah, I think I was speaking a little more broadly, but this is that's very interesting. I'm not familiar with that. I meant more just broadly speaking, you see that meme online where they show you just a fruit cup that was
Oh, yeah.
grown in Indonesia, packaged in, India or something, and then sent to the United States. And it just makes, or it was grown in South America, packaged somewhere else, like miles away, and then sent to and it just makes no sense at all. And it's just not sustainable. The whole idea of just eating locally, like local produce, local, even just on a smaller scale, community gardens and stuff like that, but having that be a greater part of our diet.
Yeah, I mean, that has to happen, and I think that's an inevitability. I mean, we've been seeing over the summer so many disasters, heat waves, floods, you name it, that are direct result of the climate crisis, and that is only going to increase in the next few years, and that's already having a huge impact on agriculture as a whole. Our sort of international interdependence in the food system is going to fall apart.
Yeah.
Similar thing you saw happen with the breakout of the Ukraine war. I mean, all of a sudden, just the grain shipments coming out of Ukraine just stopped coming. And now all of a sudden, millions of people are threatened with famine. We have become too interdependent on other countries. We absolutely have to go local. And that's also one thing that I love about vertical farming is that is a great way to do that. Because with vertical farming, since it's all indoors, you have total control of the climate and you can just keep producing fresh produce even in the middle of winter. It's an absolutely amazing technology.
So Getting back to just a reforestation, is there any discussion anywhere in the world about a worldwide effort at reforestation?
Um, I mean, there's multiple networks that are attempting to kind of create sort of international coalitions focused around reforestation. I don't know how particularly useful as a whole that would be. I think really what should happen is there should be. I mean, there's the UN has the decade of environmental restoration, but those targets are just not being met right now. What I think would be most useful is really kind of, and this Lula is trying to do this, is create a multinational coalition to restore the Amazon or to save the Amazon. Because right now, the Amazon is in a pretty bad state. It's going through something called a dieback. And what a dieback is essentially the Amazon rainforest itself was formed under very different climatic conditions than today, many millions of years ago. And that region of the world was experiencing regular rainfall. But weather patterns shifted, and all of a sudden, the rainforest had to learn to generate its own rainfall. So what happens is every time that wind comes in from the ocean bringing in moisture, that moisture condenses into clouds and then it rains, the roots of the plants will take in that rain, and then after they do their bodies do their stuff with that, they have these little organs all across their leaves called stomata, and they slowly release that water as a gas out of that stomata, and that creates negative pressure, which in turn brings in more water from whatever nearby body of water exists. And this in turn, when you take that effect and put it across an entire continent, you essentially just generate this river in the atmosphere where all of a sudden rain gets dumped. Then the plants release that moisture through their leaves and then attract more water to the area. And then the whole thing just cycles across the entire continent. The problem is we've now cut down enough of the Amazon to completely disrupt this process. So what's happening is, certain areas start to dry and then fires break out. And, this is an ecosystem that's not in any way adapted for fire. So once a fire gets in there, it just destroys everything. And those regions are then gone. So other parts of the forest all of a sudden start experiencing less rain. They dry, and then they get set on fire. And now we're sort of in this big chain reaction that's going to basically turn the Amazon into a desert unless we restore unless we restore the forests that have already been destroyed.
So would you say so basically getting more big picture, reforestation efforts should focus on places specifically to start out, and the Amazon's a great place to start?
I mean, I think reforestation efforts should just focus on the simple fact of if there's a place that can be reforested, it should be.
Okay.
Because, like I said, forests are brilliant at taking out carbon. And right now, we just got to get as much out of that out of the atmosphere as possible. And to go back to this kind of river in the sky that the Amazon is generating, that has global implications. Trade winds, Hadley cells, and various other atmospheric processes will redistribute that water, those rainfall it's generating, to other parts of the world, including like California and Canada. So, as I mentioned before, deforestation in the Amazon is actually like having a huge impact on the fires in North America.
If we don't take action, what do you think the world is going to look like in, say, 20, 30 years?
Um, Chaos, absolute chaos. I think what is going to happen is pretty much every government in a region of the world that is considered hot is going to fall apart. I think if you want an idea of what the world's going to look like 20 years from now, if we don't fix anything, I think the best idea of what that's going to look like is the Syrian refugee crisis, because that was caused by climate change. The Arab Spring that triggered that whole process was caused by a human induced heat wave that led to crop failures, and in turn, people just fleeing the region, heading to urban areas, fights breaking out. And that had global impacts as well. I mean, that was a huge factor in the right wing kind of shift we're seeing in Europe right now, that sort of xenophobia from that influx of migrants from Syria. So what I would expect in about 20 years is, just millions and millions of people fleeing from, hotter regions of the world, and seeing a massive rightward shift in governments as a result.
If we do take action, What do you think it could look like in 20, 30 years?
I think the world would be an amazing place. I mean, the reality is, in order to combat climate change, we have to restructure so many different parts of our lives. For example, like economic growth, GDP. This is something we can't continue. We cannot decouple energy consumption from GDP, which means basically, as long as we keep GDP going, we cannot get off fossil fuels. So really we'd have to restructure the economy in a way that helps people, it improves people's well-being. We'd have to implement social programs like we do see in the Nordic countries, which I do think are world leading examples. So I think right there, we'd have economies that are where the objective of the economy is no longer growth but rather human happiness, which right there I think is absolutely wonderful. I think the world would be much more full of nature. I mean, the amount of the amount of areas we could restore, it would just be amazing. I mean, imagine intact Amazon rainforest, whales everywhere, seagrass beds restored, all of this. Imagine just basically being able to like walk out of a city and the next thing you know, you're in the wilderness. That's what it would look like. And that's the kind of level of restoration that needs to be done.
That kind of, and I'm not saying like this is a total example, but that sort of makes me think of Vancouver, British Columbia a little bit, where
I've
it's
not been there.
oh, I mean, it's not like a total example of what you're describing, but there's just tons. I mean, it's a city and it's a very wonderful city. I like Vancouver a lot. But there's just this amazing rainforest all around it. And you can like hike one of the most beautiful suspension bridges I've ever seen, and then be, in a city center having lunch in the same day. And it's when you see places like that, and I'm not saying like, Canada's leading the way in anything or anything like that. It's just a naturally beautiful place, and it looks like they, make some effort to preserve it. Um, you kind of think, man, we got to do better than this. We got to do better. Because like, look at this. This is worth fighting for. This is worth saving. Um, but so how optimistic are you?
I'm not. In short,
Mm,
I I mean, I'm looking at what I'm seeing right now. So, when I was saying that Scotland, relative to other nations, is doing well, in terms of restoration, all things considered, they're still not doing that great. For example, reintroduction of wolves is right now off the table. The political situation in Scotland is not great for the reintroduction of wolves, which that's another thing that needs to happen. I mean, if you're looking at like, there's this thing called chronic wasting disease, which is it's sort of like mad cow disease, but for deer. I don't know if you're familiar with what mad cow is or.
Yeah, no, I remember when we've had a couple outbreaks of it. I'm not. I mean, you'll have to explain a little bit the connection to wolves, to me.
Oh, I'm
But
I'm getting to that. I just want to make
okay,
sure
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
groundwork
Okay.
is set there. So chronic wasting disease is sort of like, yeah, mad deer or something. And what it is kind of a wasting disease, a prion disease. It's a protein that gets introduced to your body and then gives different instructions to a bunch of other proteins in your body. And as a result, like, it basically causes your fundamental biological systems to malfunction. And
Mhm.
what's happening is it's now spreading amongst deer population like crazy. It's pretty much in every deer population in the United States. Just got to Europe. It's still very early stages there. But what's really scary is, first off, we don't know what the mechanism of transmission is. We don't know how the hell it's getting between these deer, but it's now moving to other species. So human to human transmission is something that is entirely possible. In fact, I've spoken to doctors in Pennsylvania who think they actually found a few cases, but weren't able to successfully diagnose it, from hunters who ate venison. And
Oh
the
my
way the
god.
wolves factor into this is that, when the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, they had a whole ton of impacts on it. But one of the things they did was they came in and essentially, like, by scaring deer and causing deer to avoid certain areas because the deer knew they'd be hunting, they essentially enforced social distancing between the deer populations. And as a result, basically, like, the spread was like slowing down. And on top of that, what they do is, individual deer with this disease, what they can do is, they're so much easier to hunt because they're all disoriented and zombie-like. So the wolves come in and take these deer down and eat them. And unlike other mammals, wolves are immune to this. So their stomachs actually break down the protein as opposed to like it destroying their body. So the way the wolves come into this is essentially they are our best preventative measure against this disease from actually like spreading amongst us.
So we need to eat local, get some wolves, reforest, and then we got a shot.
Oh, I mean, that's just one thing. Like I said, this is insanely complicated. Another thing is we need woolly mammoths back, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with that whole kind of thing.
You would need to walk me through that too. Yes.
Okay, I'm happy to. I'm happy.
Any species you name, I'm gonna need a little hand holding. It's like, yeah, I know what it is, but how does this connect to the bigger picture?
I understand, and yeah, I mean, this is what I'm saying. This is what
this interview. I'm going to be a big hit at parties from here on out. I mean, next time I'm at a social event, I'm going to be like, you know why we need wolves? They're going to be like, what? I'm like, wolves. Let me tell you about it. If there's something that we really if there's something we really need bats for, you need to tell me right away because I love bats.
Oh, so, no, we absolutely need bats too. Bats are amazing insect control. They dramatically reduce mosquito numbers, and reduced bat populations are linked to increased malaria cases.
Okay, so I did know that actually. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Now that you repeat it, I have heard that. All right. So woolly mammoths. How do we? What do they got to do?
So this is part of my background. Is when we left Africa, we essentially destroyed all sorts of populations of species. The thing to note is that a lot of the world used to look like Africa. Like you're in California, right?
Yes.
So California, you would have also had mammoths there. You would have had saber-toothed tigers. You would have had armadillos the size of cars. And these animals would have been alive today had humans not entered that ecosystem thousands of years ago. Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking like, oh, this all happened thousands of years ago. How's that relevant to today? But what we got to understand is nature does not operate on our timescales. 80 years, the human lifespan, that is a blink of an eye. In fact, our entire existence as a species is relatively a blink of an eye. Life on Earth has been around for 3.5 billion years, and anatomically modern humans have only been around for 300,000. But anyways, so we leave Africa, and the reason Africa is the only place that still looks like Africa is because all these animals there co-evolved alongside us. They knew what we were capable of. But these other animals never seen a human before in their life. They were very easy for us to take down. And, when you're talking about something like an elephant or a woolly mammoth, these things, their pregnancies were, over 18 months. It takes a very long time for that population to replenish. So the animal gets overhunted very easily. And unfortunately for us, these animals had very important parts in kind of these biogeophysical processes, as they're called. The woolly mammoths, in layman's terms, were essential for preserving the permafrost. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Vaguely, very vaguely.
So the permafrost is essentially a layer of dirt that is supposed to stay frozen year round. And there is a ton of carbon, a ton of methane, ton of just nasty stuff frozen in it. And us heating the planet has begun to cause the permafrost to thaw. And if the permafrost thaws a certain amount, it's basically guaranteeing the whole thing to melt. And it's going to, at minimum, release about 3 times the carbon we have in our atmosphere right now. And like I said, we have enough carbon in the atmosphere right now to basically just end everything. So it's like, this cannot melt. Now, the way woolly mammoths factored into this is snow can act as insulation. This is how an igloo can keep people warm. And you had the woolly mammoths, you had giant hairy rhinos, giant hairy deer, all these animals clearing snow during the winter to get at the vegetation underneath. So not only do they clear the snow, but they ensure the permafrost would stay exposed to the frigid Siberian winter. And that would ensure the permafrost stayed frozen. Now that they're gone, the snow just builds up over the entire winter, and then the snow melts, and all the permafrost gets exposed to is the rapidly increasing summer temperatures. So without the woolly mammoths, this whole thing is beginning to thaw and collapse, and it's just belching out large amounts of greenhouse gases. I mean, you can see footage of like certain areas in Siberia where it's like the entire earth looks like bouncy castles because all the ground beneath it has like unfrozen and there's just a ton of gas just waiting to come out.
So, wow. All right. So this list keeps getting Ronan. This list keeps growing, and I feel like we're going to need a few more people to help out here. I mean, I can. I'll spearhead the woolly mammoths. I volunteer for that. But we're going to need at least 5 or 6 more people on this task force. I feel like. Um. So, where can people go to learn more about the work you're doing, and just kind of learn more in general? And again, I know we're talking. There's so much of this is a top bottom solution, but what is the best way an individual can help to the best of their ability?
Well, like I said, switching to a vegan diet, I think, is the single most important thing anyone can do. Because the reality is, look, as individuals, we do not have much power over this. But that, I think, really is the one thing. If enough people did this, it would make a big impact. Because if the cash to the meat and dairy industry just stops flowing, it stops flowing, and the whole thing just breaks. So, on an individual level, I think that's the most important thing someone could be doing. I'm also an ardent supporter of organizations like Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. I think that form of protest is proving to be quite effective. I mean, the fact that, the UK is considering to like pass anti-protesting measures is really a testament to that. So if you feel up for it, I highly recommend supporting the work of organizations like that.
So, and that was Extinction Rebellion and Stop Fossil Fuels.
Just Stop Oil.
Stop
You
Oil.
probably
Okay,
know them. I mean, yeah,
I
they
know
caused a
Extinction
lot of
Rebellion.
Do you remember the that painting that like got like the tomato soup thrown at it?
Yes, was that Stop Oil or was that Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, that was Just Stop Oil. Yeah.
Okay, okay, all right. I didn't know. Yeah, I guess I thought it was kind of all under the Extinction Rebellion umbrella, but gotcha. So, well, and then what is the give everyone the website for your organization?
Yeah, so we are biospheric I know, real nice and small, easy to remember. Um, Everyone just calls us BRS for short, though. But
BRS.
unfortunately, that domain name was not available. So we're stuck with biospheric You can find us there, learn all about our work. You can learn more about the Green Phoenix Project, which unfortunately I was only able to describe step one there. But there's so much more to that. We're also developing a new oyster bed restoration method. We're trying to develop new ways to grow seagrass beds. There's a lot we're trying to do here. For me, the ultimate goal of this organization is to produce a standardized de-extinction method to help bring animals like the woolly mammoths back into existence so they can return to the ecosystems they once inhabited and play the important function they did.
And what would it take? I mean, kind of just give me like a very brief cliff notes. Like, what would it take to do that? Like what would it take to get those species back?
Well, I mean, in some respects, it's a lot easier than people would assume. The DNA these creatures left behind exists in abundance. And we have been able to like retrieve DNA samples that are millions of years old, and these creatures only died out 10,000 years ago, so that's absolutely nothing. But the rest really is a matter of advancements in synthetic biology. There's all sorts of absolutely amazing technologies where we're just going to be able to like produce entirely new life forms just from like synthesized DNA. In fact, it's already been done. There have been labs that have produced like entirely new organisms, things that never existed in the tree of life before, just out of bits of protein and reprogrammed DNA and everything. So it's really just a matter of technologies that already exist advancing a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, throughout this whole conversation, and I know you said, "Oh, I'm not super optimistic," and believe me, I totally get that. But you know, talking to you, it just seems like it reconfirms that we have the resources, we have the technology, we have the knowledge. We just need the political will, and we need
Yes.
governments around the world to cooperate.
Yeah, and that is the challenge. And I really see it going one of two ways, where it is because things are going to get worse. I don't see how we're going to avoid things getting a lot worse at this point. But does those things getting worse force governments into action? Does it force that systemic change? Because right now, I think our political system is far too rigid to make the big changes we need to make. I mean, just look, we couldn't even like get Sanders to like pass the primary for God's sakes. Like, and same thing happened with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Like,
Right.
the political power is just too established at this point. But can enough of a systemic breakdown trigger the changes needed? Or is that systemic breakdown just going to be a systemic breakdown and everything falls apart? That's really where I'm not sure.
Here's hoping it's the former. Ronan, thank you so much for joining me. This was a very interesting conversation, and I'm really I am very much in admiration of your work, and I hope that it continues
Oh, thanks, man.
to spread on a massive scale. And please let me know anything I can do to help. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, I was happy to be here. It was great